Welcome to Conspiracy, She Wrote. I'm your host, Cristen Conger. On this podcast, we're unraveling the overlooked relationships between women and conspiracy theories. And yes, things will get weird. But don't worry, I'm not here to brainwash you, I promise. Women are my specialty. I'm the creator and host of the Feminist Lifestyle podcast on Ladylike. I have built my podcasting and writing career by following my own curiosity / low-key obsession with why things are the way they are when it comes to women, girls, and gender. And when it comes to conspiracy theories, even though it's gone largely overlooked, women are all over the place. Grab your red string and follow along. First, let's get a lay of the land. Broadly speaking, conspiracy theories are ways of explaining things that don't make sense to us, which is a very human impulse. There's no official definition, but conspiracy theories derive from the same basic premise that people, usually rich and powerful people, are secretly plotting to achieve some kind of nefarious outcome. Cultural historian Michael Barkin also identified 3 fundamental ingredients of conspiracy thinking. Accidents don't happen. Nothing is as it seems. Everything is connected. And for our podcast purposes, we're adding a 4th ingredient to that conspiracy cocktail: women. They're monetized influencers.
Even these more mainstream, more palatable tradwives, I often notice, will discuss how there is a conspiracy essentially to attract women away from this role, which is so obviously the natural and better way for women to be.
Their stands.
The truth kind of operated on this really weird gray line where it's like, if that's how your mind works anyway, there was so much there to validate that.
They're celebrity avatars of good versus evil.
Conspiracy theorists are hitting on something. The way that people assume that means that she's doing something nefarious, and that there is this Illuminati way of running the government, running the world.
Ah, yes, the Illuminati. Whether we're talking about alleged deep state plots or the cultural power of Beyoncé, conspiracy red strings almost inevitably lead back to the Illuminati and a British conspiracy theorist named Nesta Webster.
When we kind of get into the nitty-gritty of her, she is really, to a woman, she resurrected it, she ran with it, and she is responsible she really is responsible, I think, for where we are today. Not many historians can say that.
Dr. Lindsay Porter is a writer and cultural historian who specializes in rumors and conspiracy theories of the 18th century. She's also author of the book, Who Are the Illuminati?
I don't know if you know the novel Alice Through the Looking Glass, but Humpty Dumpty says at one point, when I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. And that's where I feel like we are with the Illuminati.
And to better understand today's not-so-golden era of misinformation and what women have to do with it, we need to know how we got here and the kernel of fact that started it all nearly 250 years ago. Because yes, in the beginning, the Illuminati were real.
So the actual Illuminati were a very short-lived secret society that were founded in Bavaria. in 1776. Coincidence, but, an auspicious year.
This was a tail end of the Enlightenment, and a massive power shift was underway across Western Europe. Instead of leaving everything up to the church and its God, people really started to question all that divine, absolute authority. What about life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness? It was the talk of London coffee houses and Paris salons, and all the intellectual pamphlets and books flying off the presses faster than ever. And in 1776, while the ink was still drying on the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia, USA, the Illuminati's founding father was launching his new secret society in Ingolstadt, Bavaria, Germany. Adam Weishaupt was a law professor there with a dream. He wanted to become an Enlightenment influencer for reason and self-government, so Weishaupt started his own intellectual club, called it the Illuminati, and it had to be secret. Really.
Bavaria was really a very strictly Catholic country, and they did not want these Enlightenment texts available. They're very threatening to the status quo. So one of Adam Weishaupt's motives was to get access to these texts, literally have them smuggled in, and then share them with like-minded people. In that way, he was really following a model that was all over Europe. It was a golden age of the secret society. Freemasonry really flourished in the late 18th century. And that was something that Adam Weishaupt thought, right, well, I will create my own version of the Freemasons.
The Freemasons were the aspirational membership for elite men who apparently liked masonry metaphors and hanging out in lodges. So why didn't Weishaupt just join the Freemasons? Lindsay Porter said he tried, got rejected, and moved on to Plan B, Illuminati.
He took the secrecy, which, as I said, was important because the texts were not legal. He also took elements of ritual and hierarchy, which was really sort of part and parcel of how secret societies kind of were set up in those days. At its height, it is estimated that there were about 2,500 members stretched all over Europe, and that they came from different members of society and the aristocracy. By the time they were discovered by the Bavarian authorities in 1788, they were outlawed and their founder was sent into exile. That was really the end of them.
Aside from a few final Illuminati writings that Weishaupt published after he was kicked out of Bavaria, his secret society was done and dusted. The group was already fracturing when it got shut down, and its former members swiftly moved on. Here's where things go conspiracy. When the real Illuminati disbanded, an imaginary and menacing Illuminati soon took its place. Because less than a year later, along came the French Revolution. Monarchists, aristocrats, and religious faithfuls who survived all of the guillotining could barely fathom what had just happened. How was it even possible? A former Jesuit priest from France named Abbé Augustin Barruel decided the only explanation was conspiracy. So he wrote all about that in a 4-volume, quote-unquote, history of the French Revolution. And who were the evil culprits he came up with? Enlightenment philosophers, Freemasons, and the Illuminati, whom Barruel was convinced had not actually disbanded, but merely gone underground. Of course, Barruel had no real evidence to go on that the Illuminati still existed. But that's the thing with conspiracy theories. If nothing is as it seems, then a lack of evidence is seen as proof of a cover-up. Meanwhile, A Scottish scientist named John Robison was also freaked out by the French Revolution, and he too wrote a book blaming secret societies and their enlightened rabble-rousers for essentially brainwashing the masses into a bloody uprising.
Robison allowed for a greater readership because he also then brought in the English-speaking world. At the end of the 18th century, so again, 1798, the ideas of Barrowell and Robison make their way across the Atlantic. And for a springtime in 1798, the kind of pulpits of the New England churches are just ringing out with warnings about the Illuminati. And the idea is that whatever kind of fiends from hell set off this revolution that then turns into anarchy in France is in danger of arriving in the US. At its height, George Washington took it seriously. There is a letter in which he says, I hadn't appreciated just what a threat the Illuminati was, but, I am now convinced of it.
By the early 1800s, the panic subsided. More than a century passed without a peep about the Illuminati conspiracy. And you'd think that would be the end of it.
That was very short-lived. It really died down, within the year. And I really wonder, were it not for Nesta Webster, whether the Illuminati, again, would have just been completely forgotten. Because there were so many other threats.
Nesta, Nesta, Nesta. Ready or not, here she comes. After the break. Conspiracy She Wrote listeners, this is where an ad would usually go. And I guess this actually is an advertisement / invitation to join the cabal. No, it's not satanic. No, we don't drink any blood. It's definitely not elite, but it is a place where you can find ad-free episodes, guest interview extras, and exclusive red string unraveling. Or if you just want to say thanks for this free podcast, head on over to patreon.com/conspiracy she wrote or hit the link in this episode description and join the cabal. It's so easy. Nesta Webster was one of the most influential conspiracy theorists you've never heard of. A lady trailblazer that you really don't want to discover, but discover her we must. Nesta Webster was born into wealth in the late 1880s. She grew up ping-ponging between the family's countryside estate, their London house overlooking Hyde Park, and their villa in Cannes, France. Despite the chic dresses, Nesta had a religious and sheltered upbringing. For college, though, Nesta wanted to go to either Oxford or Cambridge University. But Nesta's mother insisted they were way too liberal and sent her to a Christian women's college instead. By 21, Nesta had reached a crossroads. She graduated college and wanted to find what she called a useful career. Except the only useful careers for women back then were schoolteacher, nurse, or volunteer. So, in a very eat, pray, love move, Nesta chose to travel instead. Egypt, India, Sri Lanka, Japan. I don't know about eating or loving, but there was definitely a lot of praying along the way. The trip was a kind of spiritual awakening for Nesta, who, again, was raised strictly Christian, and yet Buddhism intrigued her most of all.
And that's the point at which I think, perhaps in a different time and place, she could have been some sort of upper-class lady hippie, talking about, kind of spiritualist and maybe selling, nutritional supplements or something. She could have gone that way.
The way Nesta went next instead was down the wedding aisle. She then had 2 daughters. It was the early 1910s, and Nesta had a lot on her mind. She was writing her first novel, and England's suffrage movement was in full swing. Nesta supported it on principle, but she was hardly a radical. World War I was just around the corner when Nesta took the kids on an extended vacation in Switzerland. One day, Nesta was perusing the library of whatever mansion they were staying in, and lo and behold,
she comes across some letters between 2 pre-revolutionary aristocrats. And she's so taken with them and she so identifies with them that she begins to believe that she is actually a reincarnation of an aristocrat, of a French aristocrat. And she has a sensation when she is in Paris of the streets running with blood.
Nesta began obsessively researching those aristocratic lovers. She wrote her next book about them, and the book after that about the French Revolution. And surprise, surprise, both were popular with readers and critics alike. But Nesta's French Revolution fever dream took a drastic turn. She was convinced that its true origins were far more sinister than the story told in history books. And what convinced her of that? Well, that terrifying old 4-volume history by Jesuit priest Abbe Barrowell. Nesta Webster was fully Illuminati-pilled, and that's not the worst part.
I think it's really this sense that she lived through the revolution, that she begins to dig and try to work out, so what were the causes? And there is another document that has been circulating really since the beginning of the 20th century, a very, very ugly, fraudulent document, which is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And it purports to be almost like the minutes of a ritual of 12 leading Jewish figures who have met in a cemetery and they are plotting kind of world domination. And this is what she kind of adds to the Illuminati mix.
That fraudulent document is the cornerstone of the violently anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that Jews control the world. According to historian Michael Barkin, the Protocols was originally fabricated by Russian Tsar Nicholas's secret police. It was published in Russian in 1905, and by the early 1920s, it was circulating across the West, especially within the fascist circles that Nesta Webster had become active in after World War I.
So this made its way kind of crisscrossing across Europe and really just adds to the anti-Semitic fire of the era. She takes the Protocols, she takes the Illuminati, and she takes the fear of Bolshevism that is in the wake of the Russian Revolution, and she combines them all into this great toxic mix.
That great toxic mix is most on display in Nesta's 1924 book, Secret Societies and Subversive Movements. And no, this is not a book recommendation. The conspiratorial worldview she laid out probably sounds familiar 100 years later. According to Nesta, a secret, satanic cabal of elites was puppet mastering the destruction of white Christian civilization. Their ultimate goal? One world government. Nesta's proclamations of occult secret societies were too extreme for the general public, and her literary credibility swiftly soured. It's too bad podcasts weren't around, because Lord knows she probably would have built an empire from there.
I just want to make it very clear, I am in no way an apologist for her. We have to say straight out and continue to say her ideas were abhorrent. She was literally a fascist, and she has introduced some of the most long-running and hateful ideas into, the English-speaking world. So we have nothing good to say about her.
And Nesta wasn't the only woman spreading fascist Illuminati conspiracy theories.
Well, there are a pair of women who were pretty much her contemporary, and again, very, very privileged women.
One was Edith Starr Miller. Edith grew up in a Fifth Avenue mansion, married a British politician in the early 1920s, moved abroad to the London countryside, and had a few kids. During that time, Edith, now Lady Queensborough, fell deep down the conspiracy rabbit hole. She'd read a book that purported to expose the satanic underbelly of secret societies like the Freemasons. And even though that book was a proven hoax, and the author himself publicly confessed to making it up, Edith either didn't know or just didn't care. She'd also made friends with the wealthy widow of a Russian imperial officer named Pakita Louise de Shishmarev. Pakita was active in fascist political circles, adamantly anti-Semitic, and like Edith, very much believed that an evil cabal was secretly orchestrating worldwide chaos.
The pair of them self-publish a book in 1933 called The Occult Theocracy. And between the pair of them, they spend 10 years working out every single religious sect, secret society, stretching back to the kind of Knights Templar and the Rosicrucians and even beyond, before then. They do not have the reach that Nesta has because this is a self-published book, and in fact it comes out after Edith Starr Miller's death. But Pakita, for her sins, did a very elaborate chart of kind of like two-sided, 2 foot wide and a foot deep, which she called the Politico-Occult Judeo-Masonry chart.
Pakita's unhinged chart implicated the usual Illuminati conspiracy suspects, your secret societies, and just, the entire Jewish population. And it also roped in everything from the Italian mafia to yoga, and of course, Mr. Illuminati himself, Adam Weishaupt.
And she actually introduced that to Henry Ford. Henry Ford, who was, raving anti-Semite. And Pakita was also very active in the United States in trying to encourage kind of Nazism. So Nesta was not alone in being a very privileged woman, just asking questions, and they seem to come from the same position and end the same result, I'm sure there are more.
So what ultimately happened to Nesta?
After the war, when obviously she's, on the wrong side, and her husband dies, the last thing she writes is her autobiography, Spacious Days. And she publishes that in 1950, and then she dies in 1960. And she's really, again, certainly, if not a forgotten figure, an entirely discredited figure. Her Secret Societies and Subversive Movements is reprinted in 1964, which is the year then that the John Birch Society gets hold of it.
Is Nesta Webster then more influential today than she was when she was alive?
Without a doubt, in my mind, she is absolutely more influential. Whether or not people know where those ideas came from As far as I'm concerned, if she had not written about the Illuminati and that hadn't been picked up by the John Birch Society, we wouldn't be having this conversation. It's not to be said that we would not be riddled with conspiracy theories and conspiracy theorists, but we wouldn't be calling them the Illuminati.
When we left off, conspiracist Nesta Webster was about to have a posthumous comeback. In the 1960s, a far-right publisher in the US had started printing bootleg copies of Nesta's Illuminati books. That's how she became a must-read within the John Birch Society. The John Birch Society was founded in the US in the late 1950s out of peak anti-communist paranoia. An extreme harbinger of today's conspiracy-pilled MAGA right wing, Birchers made early enemies of big government and coastal elites. They perceived institutions like the United Nations as proxies for a one-world government takeover. By the mid-60s, John Birch publications were also heralding none other than Nesta Webster. Communism, Birchers were taught, was only one part of a massive Illuminati collusion out to destroy white Christian society, and it was their duty to stop it. Women, too. Even though the organization leadership was all men, their wives played significant roles, like waging Red Scare culture wars over public schooling and library books. Is any of this sounding familiar?
Again, this is very interesting because in terms of conspiracy theories, as far as I am aware, the Illuminati is the only one that you can literally kind of trace a connection, you know. By the time the John Birch Society has picked up the Illuminati and then it's kind of been caught up in the whole McCarthyite Reds under the bed scare, by the time that has been discredited, in the late 1960s, there is an underground kind of countercultural newspaper in Greenwich Village. And there are two friends who are both actually editors at Playboy. But they, for fun, a satire, they create almost like a fold out, cut out and keep vast conspiracy network that they've just made up for the fun of it.
The spoof chart was such a hit, the Playboy editors ran with it. In 1975, they published a satirical trilogy called Illuminatus! The books were sci-fi bestsellers. They even inspired a stage production, card games, role-playing games. And this was how the Illuminati myth spread from fringe right-wing politics to the left-wing counterculture to more mainstream entertainment.
What I find very interesting about Nesta Webster is it took her many years to reach her Illuminati conspiracy, whereas studies have been done about people's exposure to Fox News, and they'll become conspiracy theorists in a matter of months.
When we are thinking about today's kind of pop culture and celebrity Illuminati conspiracy theories, can we then say that ultimately they do also trace back to Nesta?
I think yes. I genuinely think that obviously it's not the Illuminati that she described, but without her, we don't have that sort of beginning point.
I mean, you got to hand it back to Adam in Bavaria. He was great with branding.
He absolutely was. He had other names. You know, he thought of calling his group other things, and they weren't nearly so catchy as Illuminati, you know? Look at him. I know. He's probably laughing at us all. So, yeah.
Nesta, though, might be cackling even louder. Fast forward to Pizzagate, Proud Boys, QAnon. Nesta Webster's worldview reverberates through it all. Well, why do you think that women in particular and their roles have really flown under the radar so much in conspiracy culture and history?
I love that question. And I love the fact you're addressing it because I think it really needs to be addressed. So, quite a short and maybe superficial answer is that women's history, let's argue and say it's overlooked and underrepresented anyway. And if you are a woman's historian, you might prefer to look at positive contributions. And that's really, I mean, perhaps that's too simplistic an answer, but it feels to me like a possible answer.
Did you ever imagine that your interest in the 18th century, all of this would become so relevant to today's current landscape?
I promise you I absolutely did not, but there is something about the past that feels like it allows you to slightly step back from the present. And yet there are always ripples and currents that feed back into one another. When I was looking at material to do with rumor during the French Revolution, one of the reasons why rumors sped quickly and so perniciously was that there was a completely unregulated burst in newsprint. And with events happening so quickly, it was very hard for people to establish what had actually happened and when and who was responsible. And while I was working on that, it was as though the internet and social media had gone from something that we sort of felt like we knew how to use to just a Wild West. So that was a parallel that I hadn't really expected.
Thank you so much to Dr. Lindsay Porter. You can read her fascinating history, Who Are the Illuminati?, which I read and highly recommend. You can also read Assassination, A Political History, and Popular Rumor in Revolutionary Paris. And coming up next time,
particularly in recent conspiracy movements, there has been a really strong positive self-identity for women involved in them as a kind of warrior mother who was protecting her family, shielding them from these poisonous and very dark, malevolent forces that were trying to penetrate not just the family unit, but their very bodies.
Conspiracy, She Wrote is an unladylike media production, created, hosted, and executive produced by me, Cristen Conger. Lushik Lotus Lee is our producer, Amita Ganatra is our engineer, and music is from Blue Dot Sessions. Well, is there anything else that we have not covered about Nesta or the Illuminati or your work that you want to make sure that listeners know?
No, we're done. In fact, it's the last word on the Illuminati. No one has to talk about it ever again. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad we solved it.
That's it. Next, yeah.